I never thought I'd spend my own son's wedding hiding behind a kitchen door, watching through a crack as strangers celebrated what should have been the happiest day of my life. The smell of garlic and rosemary from the catering station mixed with the sweet fragrance of white roses drifting in from the reception hall, creating this nauseating cocktail that I'll never forget. My hands were trembling as I clutched a crumpled tissue, the navy blue fabric of my carefully chosen dress, the one I'd saved for 6 months to buy, already wrinkled from being pressed against the cold metal doorframe. But there I was, relegated to the servants' quarters like some unwanted piece of furniture, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and celebration that should have included me. The servers rushed past me carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their black uniforms crisp and professional, while I stood there in my mother-of-the-groom dress, feeling like an intruder at my own son's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, who had worked in restaurants my entire adult life, was now trapped in the kitchen during the most important day of my family's life. Through that narrow crack in the door, I could see the crystalline chandelier casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor of the reception hall. The tables were draped in ivory silk, adorned with towering centerpieces of white peonies and baby's breath that probably cost more than my monthly rent. 200 guests sat at perfectly arranged tables, their designer dresses and tailored suits a stark contrast to my off-the-rack ensemble. And there, at the head table that should have included me, sat my daughter-in-law's father, Robert Castellano, about to give a toast that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. When Sarah collapsed to that marble floor in her pristine white dress, a confection of silk and lace that cost more than my car, the sound she made was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was part sob, part scream, part something primal and broken that came from the very core of her being. The crystal glasses that had been raised in celebration crashed to the floor around her, creating a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo the breaking of our lives. Because in that moment, when Robert's words hung in the air like poison, I realized that the secret he revealed wasn't just hers to bear, it was mine too. The daughter I had given away 31 years ago, the child I had held for exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes before placing her in the arms of strangers, was the woman my son had just married. The woman I had come to love like the daughter I'd always dreamed of having was, in fact, the daughter I'd given up. Before I continue with this story that still makes my hands shake and my chest tighten with a pain so acute it feels like drowning, I need you to understand something. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not because they mean to, but because love makes us vulnerable in ways we never expect. And sometimes the truth we've been running from our entire lives has a way of finding us when we least expect it, dressed in a wedding gown and calling us mom without knowing the weight of that word. If stories like this one resonate with you, stories about family secrets, impossible choices, and the courage it takes to rebuild when everything falls apart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. And I promise you, this story will change how you think about love, family, and the price of keeping secrets. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 32 years ago, when I was young and naive and believed that love could conquer anything. I was 23 years old, working double shifts at Murphy's Diner on 5th Street, my hands perpetually stained with coffee and smelling of grease no matter how much I scrubbed them with the industrial soap in the employee bathroom. The scent of bacon and hash browns had seeped into my clothes, my hair, my very pores, becoming as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. My dreams were bigger than my bank account. I wanted to open my own restaurant someday, a place where people didn't just come to eat, but to feel at home. I had notebooks filled with menu ideas, sketches of dining rooms with warm lighting and mismatched chairs that somehow worked perfectly together. But reality was the cramped one-bedroom apartment I shared with my roommate Lisa above Chen's Golden Dragon, where the smell of sweet and sour pork mixed with the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep through the walls no matter what we did. The apartment was barely 500 square feet, with walls so thin I could hear Mrs. Chen downstairs arguing with her suppliers every morning at dawn in rapid Cantonese, her voice rising and falling like angry music. The radiator clanged like a ghost in chains throughout the winter months, and the shower barely produced enough hot water for one person, let alone two. But it was mine, or at least half mine, and that freedom was worth every inconvenience. Lisa worked nights at the hospital as a nurse's aide, so our schedules rarely overlapped. I'd come home exhausted at midnight, my feet screaming from standing for 12 hours straight, to find her getting ready for her shift. We'd pass like ships in the night, sharing instant coffee and whatever leftover pie I'd managed to sneak home from the diner. She was saving money for nursing school, and I was saving for my restaurant dream, both of us living on ramen noodles and determination. That's when I met David. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday evening in October, turning the streets into rivers and sending customers into Murphy's seeking shelter as much as food. I was working the dinner shift alone. Our other waitress had called in sick again. When he walked in around 8 o'clock, everything about him screamed money. The way he carried himself, shoulders straight and confident. The expensive wool coat that probably cost more than I made in a month. The way his dark hair was perfectly styled despite having just walked through a downpour. He paused in the doorway, scanning the diner with eyes that seemed to take in everything. The cracked vinyl booth seats, the flickering fluorescent light over table 6 that I'd been meaning to ask Murphy to fix, the coffee stains on the checkerboard linoleum floor that no amount of mopping could fully erase. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave, find somewhere more suited to his obvious wealth. Instead, he chose the booth by the window, the one with the best view of the street, but also the wobbly table that I always warned customers about. "Good evening," I said, approaching with my order pad and the smile I'd perfected after 3 years of dealing with every kind of customer imaginable. "Coffee to start, please." His voice was soft, cultured, with just a hint of nervousness that seemed at odds with his polished appearance. "And whatever pie you'd recommend." I studied him more carefully then, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he removed his coat, the tension in his shoulders despite his relaxed posture. His eyes kept darting to the window like he was expecting someone, or maybe watching for someone he hoped wouldn't appear. "The apple pie is fresh," I said, "made this morning by Murphy's wife. She uses Granny Smith apples and just the right amount of cinnamon. Not too sweet, not too tart. Perfect." He smiled then, and something about it made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with the 3 cups of coffee I'd already consumed during my shift. I brought him his coffee and pie, noting how he wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to warm himself from the inside out. The pie sat untouched for several minutes while he stared out at the rain-slicked street. When he finally took a bite, his eyes closed in what looked like genuine pleasure. "This is incredible," he said when I came to refill his cup. "You weren't exaggerating." "Mrs. Murphy has a gift," I agreed. "She taught me her recipe, but mine never turns out quite the same." "You bake?" "I cook everything. It's what I want to do. Open my own restaurant someday." I don't know why I told him that. I barely knew him, but something about the way he listened, really listened, made me want to share my dreams. "What kind of restaurant?" I set the coffee pot down on the table, ignoring Murphy's rule about not lingering with customers. There was something about this man that drew me in, made me want to ignore all my usual caution. "Comfort food," I said. "The kind of place where people come when they've had a hard day, where the food reminds them of home or makes them feel like they have one. Mismatched plates and cloth napkins, maybe some live music on weekends. Nothing fancy, just real." He was watching me intently now, his coffee forgotten. "That sounds perfect. What about you? What do you do?" His expression shifted slightly, became more guarded. "Business school at the university. My family has expectations." The way he said expectations made it sound like a prison sentence. I was about to ask more when the bell over the door chimed and a group of college kids stumbled in, loud and laughing and clearly looking for somewhere to sober up before heading home. The spell was broken, and I had to get back to work. But David stayed. Through the dinner rush, through the cleanup, through the slow hours when the rain finally stopped and the diner emptied out. He ordered more coffee, picked at a piece of chocolate cake, read a paperback book he pulled from his coat pocket. Every time I glanced his way, he was watching me, and every time our eyes met, I felt that flutter again. When my shift ended at 11, he was still there. "This is probably forward of me," he said as I hung up my apron. "But would you like to get coffee sometime? Real coffee? Not whatever this place serves?" I laughed. "What's wrong with our coffee?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "I just meant somewhere we could talk without you having to work." I should have said no. He was clearly from a different world than mine, and different worlds rarely mixed well. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness that I recognized because it lived in my own chest. "Okay," I said, "but only if you tell me your name first. I can't go to coffee with a stranger." "David," he said, extending his hand. "David Morrison." "Catherine," I replied, shaking his hand and feeling the calluses on my fingers against his soft palm. "Catherine Thompson. For 6 months, we were inseparable." David would pick me up after my shifts in a sleek black sedan that purred like a contented cat, and we'd drive to the lake outside town. There was a spot he knew, a secluded cove where willows dipped their branches into the water, and the city lights reflected like fallen stars. We'd sit on a blanket he kept in his trunk, soft cashmere that probably cost more than my weekly salary, and talk about everything and nothing. He brought me books of poetry, volumes by Neruda and Dickinson, with passages highlighted in pencil. He'd read to me in that soft voice of his while I leaned against his shoulder, feeling more cultured and sophisticated than I ever had in my life. In return, I shared my grandmother's stories, tales of growing up poor but loved, of making magic from simple ingredients and finding joy in small things. "You have this way of seeing beauty everywhere," he told me one night in December, when the lake was frozen and we could see our breath in the cold air. "It's like you carry sunshine with you. Maybe you just needed someone to show you where to look," I replied, and he kissed me then, soft and sweet, and tasting like the peppermint hot chocolate we'd shared from his thermos. But even in those perfect moments, there were shadows. David never took me to his apartment, always insisting on meeting at my place or somewhere neutral. When I asked about it, he'd deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. He paid for everything in cash, never credit cards, and sometimes I caught him checking his watch like he was on some invisible timer. "Where do you live anyway?" I asked him one evening as we sat in Murphy's during my break. It was January, and the diner was warm and steamy while snow fell outside the windows. "Near campus," he said vaguely. "Nothing special. I'd like to see it sometime." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's really not worth seeing. Just a basic apartment. I live above a Chinese restaurant, David. I'm not exactly high maintenance." "I know, it's just—" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his tell when he was nervous. "My roommate is difficult. Parties all the time. Brings random people home. It's not a good environment." I wanted to push, but something in his eyes warned me off. There was a sadness there, or maybe fear, that made me swallow my questions and change the subject. I told myself that everyone was entitled to their privacy, that he'd share more when he was ready. I was so naive. When I asked about his family, the reaction was even stronger. His entire body would tense, and he'd find sudden interest in whatever was in front of him. His food, a book, the pattern of ice crystals on the window. "We're not close," he'd say, and something in his tone made it clear the subject was closed. "But surely you talk to them sometimes? Holidays? Birthdays? Catherine, please, can we not do this right now?" The pain in his voice was real, so I stopped asking. I constructed elaborate stories in my head to explain his secrecy. Maybe he came from a family of criminals, or religious fanatics, or people who wouldn't approve of him dating a waitress. Whatever it was, I told myself, we'd work through it together. Love could overcome anything, couldn't it? God, I was so young. The signs were there if I'd wanted to see them. The expensive clothes that never seemed to run out, despite his claims of being a poor college student. The way he always knew which restaurants were good, which wines paired with what foods. Cultural references that spoke of private schools and country club upbringings. The fact that his hands were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never worked a physical job in his life. But I was blinded by love, real love, the kind that made me feel like I was living in a fairy tale. When David looked at me, I felt beautiful, interesting, worthy of attention and affection. He'd trace patterns on my skin while I talked about my dreams, listened to my ideas about the restaurant like they were brilliant instead of naive. He made me feel like anything was possible. "You should go to culinary school," he said one night in February. We were in his car after my shift, the heater running to combat the bitter cold outside. "Really learn the technical side of cooking." "With what money?" I laughed. "I can barely afford rent." "There are scholarships, grants. I could help you research." "David, I appreciate the thought, but culinary school is for people like you, people with family money and safety nets. I have to work." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the empty parking lot. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. "What if you didn't have to work? What if someone believed in your dreams enough to invest in them?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," he turned to look at me, his eyes intense in the dim light from the street lamp. "I mean, I love you, Catherine. I love your passion, your dreams, the way you make everyone around you feel special. I want to be part of that." My heart stopped. "David, I know it's fast, and I know I'm probably not saying this right, but I want a future with you. I want to help you build that restaurant, watch you become everything you're meant to be." Are you proposing? He laughed, but it sounded nervous. Not yet, but someday, yes. When the timing is right, when I can do it properly. I kissed him then, pouring all my love and hope and dreams into that kiss. The windows fogged up around us, creating a private world where anything seemed possible. I love you too, I whispered against his lips. I love you so much it scares me. Don't be scared, he murmured back. We're going to have everything we want. But even as I melted into his arms, part of me wondered about that phrase, when the timing is right. What was he waiting for? What had to happen before he could commit to me completely? I got my answer in March, in the worst possible way. I remember the exact moment I knew something had changed in my body. I was working the breakfast shift, the one I usually loved because the morning regulars were friendly and the tips were decent. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for scrambled eggs and wheat toast, was telling me about her grandson's latest achievements when the smell of bacon hit me like a physical blow. The nausea was immediate and overwhelming. I barely made it to the employee bathroom before losing everything I'd eaten for breakfast, which admittedly wasn't much, just coffee and a piece of toast grabbed hastily before my shift. I knelt on the cold tile floor, my uniform soaking up water from a persistent leak under the sink, and tried to understand what was happening to my body. "Catherine?" Lisa's voice called through the door. She'd picked up an extra shift to help pay for her nursing school textbooks. "You okay in there, hun?" "I think I'm getting sick," I called back weakly. "Food poisoning? Maybe." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't food poisoning. My period was late, 12 days late, which I'd been trying not to think about. My breasts had been tender for a week, and I'd been exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The signs were there. I'd just been too scared to acknowledge them. Lisa found me 20 minutes later, still sitting on the bathroom floor, staring at the water-stained wall. "Catherine, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I'm pregnant," I whispered, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it hadn't. Lisa's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "No, yes. I don't know." I struggled to my feet, legs shaky. My period's late, and the bacon smell? "Okay, honey, let's not panic." Lisa's voice was calm, professional, the voice she used with patients at the hospital. "We need to get you a test. Can you finish your shift?" I nodded, though the thought of facing food smells for another 4 hours made my stomach churn. But Murphy was already short-staffed, and I couldn't afford to lose this job, especially if I was actually pregnant. The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I moved mechanically through the familiar motions, taking orders, pouring coffee, delivering plates, while my mind raced through possibilities. If I was pregnant, what would David say? We'd talked about the future, about marriage, about building something together. Surely this just moved up our timeline. After work, Lisa and I went to the drugstore 3 blocks from our apartment. I was embarrassed by how my hands shook as I selected the pregnancy test, by how the cashier seemed to look at me with judgment, though she probably couldn't have cared less. Lisa paid for it. I was too rattled to remember my wallet, and we walked home in silence. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. Lisa sat with me on the edge of my narrow bed while we waited for the results, holding my hand and telling me stories about the funny patients she'd met during her last shift. But I couldn't focus on her words. All I could think about was the plastic stick on my dresser, the tiny window that would determine my entire future. When the timer went off, we both looked. 2 pink lines, unmistakable, undeniable, 2 pink lines. I was pregnant. "Oh, honey," Lisa said softly, pulling me into a hug as the reality hit me like a freight train. I was 23 years old, working for minimum wage plus tips, living in a rundown apartment with a roommate. I had no health insurance, no savings to speak of, no family support system. My grandmother, who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 15, had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me truly alone in the world. But I had David who loved me, who wanted a future with me, who had talked about timing and doing things properly. This wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwanted either. We could make this work. Love could overcome anything, right? I called him that night, my hands trembling as I dialed the number I knew by heart. "David, can you come over? I need to talk to you about something important." There was a pause, and in that pause, I heard something that should have warned me. Hesitation, calculation, fear. "Is everything all right? I'd rather discuss it in person." "Okay, give me an hour." He arrived in 45 minutes, carrying flowers, daisies from the grocery store, my favorites. The gesture was sweet, but there was something off about his demeanor. He seemed nervous, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Catherine, before you say anything, I need to tell you something. My heart sank. Those words never led anywhere good. What is it? He sat on my couch, a second-hand piece covered with a blanket to hide the worn spots, and looked everywhere but at me. The fluorescent light from the Chinese restaurant downstairs filtered through my thin curtains, casting strange shadows across his face. My family. They've been pressuring me about my future, about the direction my life is taking. Okay. I sat beside him, trying to read his expression. They've offered me an opportunity, a position with my father's company, but it requires me to relocate to California. California, 3,000 miles away. For how long? That's just it. It's permanent. A management track position that could lead to partnership eventually. It's everything I've been working toward. I felt like I was drowning. What are you saying, David? I'm saying that my family has made it clear that certain associations would be detrimental to this opportunity. Associations? He finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not the warmth and love I'd grown accustomed to, but something cold and calculating. They know about us, Catherine, about our relationship. They don't approve. Don't approve of what? Of me? Of the differences in our backgrounds. The words hit me like a slap. So what are you saying? That you're choosing your family's money over us? It's not that simple. It is that simple. I stood up, anger and hurt warring in my chest. Either you love me enough to fight for us, or you don't. Catherine, please, you have to understand. This isn't just about money. It's about my entire future, my career, my family relationships. And what about our future? What about our relationship? He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I saw my answer. I saw the man I'd thought I loved for who he really was. Someone who would always choose the easy path, the safe path, the path that led back to his privileged world where girls like me didn't exist. I think, he said slowly, that we both knew this was temporary, a beautiful moment, but not sustainable. Temporary? My voice came out strangled. David, I love you. I thought you loved me. I do love you. That's what makes this so hard. If you loved me, you wouldn't be having this conversation. He stood then, reaching for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't bear his touch, not when he was in the process of destroying everything I thought we had. Catherine, please. I need you to understand. No, I understand perfectly. My voice was steadier now, anger giving me strength. You've been slumming it with the poor girl, and now it's time to go back to your real life. That's not fair, isn't it? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw clearly for the first time. The expensive clothes, the soft hands, the casual way he spent money without thinking about it. All the signs I'd ignored because I wanted to believe in the fairy tale. There's something else, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Something I need to tell you. He must have heard something in my tone because his face went white. What? I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched his face cycle through emotions, shock, fear, something that might have been calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Are you sure? I took a test today. I'm sure. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands. God, Catherine, the timing. The timing is what it is, David. The question is what we're going to do about it. What do you want to do? The way he asked it, clinical, detached, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a man ready to embrace fatherhood. This wasn't a man ready to fight for our family. I want to keep the baby, I said firmly. I want us to keep the baby, Catherine. He looked up at me with something that might have been pity. You have to be realistic. You're 23, you work at a diner, you have no family support. How are you going to raise a child? We'll figure it out. Together. There is no together. The words came out harder than he'd probably intended. I'm leaving for California next month. So just like that? You're abandoning me? Abandoning your child? I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm being practical. You should consider other options. Other options? Adoption. There are families out there who can provide things we can't. Stability, financial security, love? Of course love. But love isn't enough to raise a child, Catherine. Children need more than love. I stared at him. This man I'd thought I knew. This man I'd given my heart to completely. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship for what it really was. A fantasy I'd constructed around someone who had never actually existed. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my apartment. Now. Catherine, please. Let's talk about this rationally. There's nothing rational about any of this. I was screaming now. Months of suppressed doubts and ignored red flags pouring out all at once. There's nothing rational about loving someone who sees you as a temporary distraction. There's nothing rational about trusting someone who was just waiting for the right moment to disappear. He stood up, grabbing his coat. I'll call you in a few days. When you've had time to think, don't call me. Don't come back here. Don't contact me ever again. Catherine, I mean it, David. We're done. He paused at the door, and for a moment, I thought he might say something that would change everything. Instead, he just nodded and left, taking my heart and my faith in love with him. I found out later, through a mutual acquaintance at the university, that David Morrison wasn't even his real name. His full name was David Morrison Ashford III, heir to a shipping fortune that traced back 4 generations. The management position in California was actually the family business, and he'd been slated for it since birth. His business school education was really a formality before taking his place in the company dynasty. More devastating was learning that he'd been engaged the entire time we were together. Engaged to a woman named Victoria, from a suitable family, someone his parents had probably selected before he could walk. Our entire relationship, 6 months of what I thought was real love, had been nothing more than his last hurrah before settling into his predetermined life. I was just a dalliance, a walk on the wild side before he married the woman who would fit seamlessly into his world of country clubs and charity galas. But I was pregnant with his child, and I had to figure out what to do next. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. The morning sickness hit with a vengeance, making it almost impossible to work around food. I lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, surviving on saltines and ginger ale when I could keep anything down at all. Lisa helped as much as she could, but she was struggling with her own financial pressures, working double shifts to pay for school while keeping up with her studies. I considered my options, all of them bad. I could keep the baby and try to raise it alone, but the math was stark and unforgiving. Minimum wage plus tips barely covered my rent and basic expenses as it was. Adding medical bills, childcare, and everything else that came with a baby seemed impossible. I could terminate the pregnancy, but something deep inside me rebelled at that option. This child, whatever the circumstances of its conception, was part of me. Or I could consider adoption. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. But as the weeks passed and my situation became more desperate, I started researching. I visited social workers, read pamphlets, attended support groups for women considering placement. You can choose the family, the social worker Mrs. Henderson explained during our first meeting. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had placed hundreds of children over her career. You can be as involved or uninvolved in the process as you want. Some birth mothers want to meet the adoptive parents. Some prefer to remain anonymous. Some want ongoing contact. Others prefer a clean break. What do you think is best? For the baby, I mean. Mrs. Henderson smiled gently. There's no right or wrong answer, Catherine. Every situation is different. The important thing is that you feel comfortable with your decision. What if I change my mind? After the baby is born? Legally, you have a certain period to revoke consent, but emotionally, Catherine, I won't lie to you. Placing a child for adoption is one of the hardest things a mother can do, but it can also be one of the most loving. I left that meeting with a stack of profiles, manila folders containing the hopes and dreams of couples desperate for a child. Reading through them was heartbreaking. Page after page of people who had tried for years to have biological children, who had endured miscarriage after miscarriage, failed fertility treatments, the devastation of infertility. There were young couples just starting their families and older couples who had given up hope, same-sex couples, single mothers by choice, military families, families who ran farms or lived in big cities. The variety was overwhelming, but certain profiles stood out. Robert and Diane Castellano had been trying to have a child for 8 years. She was 34, he was 37. They owned several successful restaurants in the state and lived in a beautiful home with a nursery they'd prepared years earlier, still waiting for the child they couldn't conceive. Diane's letter was heartbreaking in its honesty. We've been through 6 rounds of IVF, 3 miscarriages, and more heartbreak than I thought we could survive. But we still believe we're meant to be parents, and we have so much love to give. We can offer your child everything: financial security, educational opportunities, a loving extended family, and most importantly, parents who have wanted them since before they existed. Their photo showed an attractive couple in their 30s, standing in front of a large colonial house with what appeared to be acres of beautiful landscaping. Robert was tall and distinguished-looking, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Diane was petite and blonde, with an infectious laugh that somehow came through in the photograph. They wanted an open adoption, with ongoing contact if the birth mother desired it. They believed that children should know their origins, their stories, their birth families. They seemed perfect, but reading their file also made me realize what I couldn't give my child: the financial security, the beautiful home, the luxury of having one parent able to stay home full-time, the extended family, the vacation photos from exotic locations, the college fund that would ensure my child's future education. I was living paycheck to paycheck in a rundown apartment, working a job with no health insurance and no real prospects for advancement. I had no family, no support system, no safety net if something went wrong. What could I offer that would compete with what the Castellanos could provide? The answer was simple and devastating. Love wasn't enough. I met with Robert and Diane when I was 6 months pregnant, my belly finally showing despite my earlier weight loss. We met at a neutral location, a family restaurant that Mrs. Henderson often used for these meetings. I was nervous, wearing my only decent dress and the cardigan my grandmother had knitted for me years earlier. I felt shabby and young next to the Castellanos, who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, but they were warm, genuine, interested in me as a person, rather than just as the vessel carrying their future child. Diane cried when I told her about my pregnancy, about David's abandonment, about my struggles to figure out the best path forward. "You're so brave," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be." Robert was more reserved but equally kind. He asked thoughtful questions about my health, my family medical history, my hopes for the adoption process. They shared stories about their own struggles with infertility, their dreams of parenthood, their plans for the child they hoped to raise. "We want you to know," Robert said toward the end of our meeting, "that we don't take this lightly. This child will know about you, about the sacrifice you're making. They'll know how loved they are by everyone involved. Would you want me to be part of their life as they grow up?" Diane and Robert exchanged glances, something I couldn't quite read passing between them. "We're open to that," Diane said carefully. "We think it's important for children to know their origins, but we'd want to make sure any contact was healthy for everyone involved, especially the child." I nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They were willing to include me, but on their terms, in their way, which was probably for the best. I had no experience with any of this, no knowledge of what was normal or healthy in adoption relationships. "There's something else we should discuss," Robert said. "We'd like to be present for the birth, if you're comfortable with that, and we'd like to take the baby home from the hospital." The reality of what I was agreeing to hit me like a physical blow. I would carry this child for 9 months, go through labor and delivery, and then hand my baby to strangers to raise. I wouldn't take the baby home, wouldn't have those first precious days and weeks of bonding, wouldn't experience any of the normal markers of new motherhood. Would it be possible for me to hold the baby before you take her home?" "Her?" Diane's eyes lit up. "You're having a girl?" I nodded and watched as Diane started crying again. "We've always dreamed of having a daughter." "Yes," Robert said quickly, seeing my emotional state. "Of course you can hold her, as long as you want." I signed the papers that day, legally committing to placing my daughter with the Castellanos. Mrs. Henderson explained the process, the timeline, the legal protections in place for everyone involved. It all felt surreal, like I was making decisions about someone else's life. The next 3 months passed in a blur of doctor's appointments, preparation, and emotional turmoil. I worked as long as I could, finally having to quit when I was too big to navigate the tight spaces in the diner. Lisa helped me apply for government assistance to cover basic expenses, a humbling experience that reinforced my belief that I was making the right choice. I wrote letters to my daughter, pages and pages of thoughts and feelings and hopes for her future. I told her about David, about our love story and its painful ending. I told her about my grandmother, about the recipes and stories and wisdom that had shaped me. I told her about my dreams for my own future, the restaurant I still hoped to open someday, the life I wanted to build. Most importantly, I told her how much I loved her, how every choice I was making was motivated by that love. "I hope someday you'll understand," I wrote in my last letter, penned the night before my due date. "I hope you'll know that giving you up isn't about not wanting you. It's about wanting everything for you that I can't provide. I hope you'll have the childhood I dreamed of but could never give you. And I hope that someday, if you want to know me, you'll find a way back to the woman who loved you enough to let you go. Labor started on a Wednesday morning in June, 3 days before my due date. I called Mrs. Henderson first, then the Castellanos, then took a cab to the hospital. Lisa met me there, taking time off from her own job to be my support person through the most difficult day of my life. The labor was long and difficult, 18 hours of increasingly intense pain, complicated by the fact that I'd had minimal prenatal care due to financial constraints. But finally, at 6:47 p.m. on June 15th, my daughter entered the world with a cry that seemed to fill the entire delivery room. "She's beautiful," the doctor said, placing her on my chest for just a moment before taking her away to be cleaned and examined. Beautiful didn't begin to cover it. She was perfect. From her tiny fists to her shock of dark hair to her deep blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. In that moment, holding her against my chest, I understood love in a way I never had before. This wasn't the romantic love I'd felt for David, or even the familial love I'd had for my grandmother. This was something primal and fierce and unconditional, a love that would move mountains or burn down worlds if necessary, and I was about to give her away. Robert and Diane arrived an hour later, both of them crying as they looked at their daughter through the nursery window. They were patient, letting me have time with her first, but I could see the longing in their eyes, the way they looked at her like she was a miracle made manifest. I held her for 4 hours and 23 minutes. I memorized every detail of her face, the way her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, the soft sounds she made when she slept. I sang to her, "You Are My Sunshine," the same song my grandmother had sung to me, and watched her eyes focus on my face like she was memorizing me too. "I need to tell you something," I whispered to her during our last moments alone. "Your name isn't going to be the one I chose. Your new parents are going to call you Sarah, which is a beautiful name, but I want you to know that in my heart, you'll always be Grace, because that's what you are, grace incarnate, an undeserved gift that I'm passing on to people who will love you the way you deserve." When it was time, Mrs. Henderson came into my room with the final papers. "Are you sure, Catherine? This is your last chance to change your mind." I looked down at my daughter, at Grace, at Sarah, sleeping peacefully in my arms. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hold on, to find a way to make it work, to refuse to let her go. But I thought about the Castellanos' beautiful home, their financial security, their years of preparation for this moment. I thought about my own empty bank account, my uncertain future, my complete lack of family support. "I'm sure," I said, though it felt like ripping out my own heart. "The transfer was gentle but devastating," Diane cried as she took Sarah into her arms, and Robert put his hand on my shoulder with genuine compassion. "Thank you," Diane whispered. "We'll take such good care of her." "I know you will," I managed to say around the lump in my throat. "We'll send pictures," Robert promised. "Updates. We want you to know how she's doing." I nodded, unable to speak. They walked out of my hospital room carrying my daughter, and I felt like my soul had been torn in half. For the first 6 months, they kept their promise. Pictures arrived monthly, showing Sarah growing and developing, hitting milestones, looking happy and healthy and loved. The Castellanos wrote letters describing her personality, her preferences, her development. Diane especially seemed committed to keeping me informed, sharing details about Sarah's first smile, her first tooth, her first attempts at crawling, but gradually, the communication tapered off. The monthly pictures became quarterly, then twice a year, then just holiday cards. The letters became shorter, more generic, until they stopped altogether. By Sarah's second birthday, I was receiving only a single photo at Christmas with a brief note about how well she was doing. I understood. They were busy raising a toddler, building their family, creating their own traditions and memories. Sarah was theirs now, fully and completely, and I was just a reminder of her origins that they were probably better off forgetting, but I never forgot. Every year on June 15th, I celebrated her birthday alone, wondering what she looked like now, what her personality was like, whether she was happy. I kept all the photos they'd sent carefully preserved in a photo album, watching her grow from a distance like a ghost haunting her childhood. I threw myself into work, eventually saving enough money to take night classes in business management. It took me 7 years, but I finally opened my own restaurant, a small cafe called Grace's Kitchen, named for the daughter I'd never been able to raise. It wasn't the grand establishment I'd once dreamed of, but it was mine, and it was successful enough to provide me with the financial stability I'd lacked at 23, but something was still missing. The restaurant was fulfilling professionally, but personally I felt incomplete. There was a space in my life, a void that no amount of career success could fill. I dated occasionally, but every relationship felt hollow compared to the love I'd shared with David, and I couldn't bring myself to fully trust anyone again. When I was 31, the same age I'd been when I gave birth to Sarah, I met James at a business conference. He was a widower with a 2-year-old son named Matthew, struggling to balance single parenthood with running his own accounting firm. We were both wounded people, both carrying losses that had shaped us, and our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual understanding rather than passionate romance. James proposed after we'd been dating for 8 months, not with grand gestures or romantic declarations, but with a simple, honest conversation about building a life together. "I know you have history," he said one evening as we watched Matthew sleep in his crib, "and I know I'm not your first choice, but I think we could be good together. I think we could make a family that works." I said yes, not because I was madly in love, but because I wanted to be a mother, and Matthew needed a mother, and sometimes practical love is stronger than passionate love anyway. We married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Matthew totting between us during the vows. For 4 years we were happy, not the earth-shattering happiness I'd felt with David, but the steady, comfortable happiness of a partnership that worked. James was a good father and a decent husband. He never made me feel like a consolation prize, never made me pay for his first wife's death or my own complicated past. Matthew accepted me easily, calling me mom from the beginning, and seeming to thrive with the stability our marriage provided. But when Matthew was 6, James was diagnosed with cancer, aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that takes everything away before you have a chance to fight it. He died 8 months later, leaving me with a 6-year-old son who had now lost 2 parents, and a life insurance policy that was enough to keep us stable, but not wealthy. Matthew was devastated by his father's death, and for months, I wasn't sure either of us would survive the grief. He had nightmares, refused to eat, clung to me with a desperation that broke my heart. I took him to counselors, tried everything I could think of to help him process the loss, but ultimately, what healed him was time, and the simple fact that I wasn't going anywhere. "Are you going to leave me too?" he asked one night during his bedtime routine, about 6 months after James's funeral. "Never," I said firmly. "You're my son, Matthew. Nothing will ever change that. Promise?" "I promise." And I kept that promise. Matthew became the center of my universe in a way that felt both natural and like penance. I'd given away 1 child. I would move heaven and earth to protect the one I was raising. I worked 2 jobs to pay for private school, drove him to every sports practice and school event, helped with homework every night, and made sure he knew every day how loved and wanted he was. Matthew thrived under this attention. He was a good kid, smart, kind, responsible, everything a mother could hope for. He excelled in school, played soccer and baseball, had friends and interests, and the kind of normal, happy childhood I'd dreamed of giving Sarah but couldn't. As he got older, we developed a close relationship that went beyond typical parent and child. We were each other's family, each other's primary emotional support, each other's best friend. He told me about his crushes, his dreams for the future, his fears and hopes and everything in between. I helped him navigate adolescence and high school, celebrated his achievements and supported him through his failures. When he got a full scholarship to business school, I cried with pride. When he graduated summa cum laude, I was in the front row cheering. When he got his first job at the marketing firm, I took him out to dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town to celebrate. "I want to find someone like you someday," he told me that night over dessert. "Someone who loves unconditionally, who puts family first, who makes everything better just by being there. You deserve all of that and more," I said, and I meant it. Matthew was my greatest success, my redemption for every mistake I'd made before he came into my life, which is why, when he brought Sarah home for the first time 3 years ago, my immediate reaction was pure joy. She was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law: warm, funny, intelligent, clearly head over heels in love with my son. She was beautiful in a natural way that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who at first. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sarah Castellano," Matthew said that first night, and the name struck me as familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said, offering her hand with a warm smile that lit up her entire face. "Call me Catherine, please. And it's wonderful to meet you too." But as the evening progressed, I felt increasingly unsettled by something I couldn't name. Sarah had mannerisms that seemed familiar, a way of wrinkling her forehead when she was thinking that triggered some deep recognition. When she helped me clear the table after dinner, she moved around my kitchen like she belonged there, asking where things went and seeming to know intuitively how I liked things organized. "You have such a beautiful home," she said, looking around my modest house with genuine appreciation. "It feels so warm and welcoming. I always wanted to grow up in a house like this." "What kind of house did you grow up in?" "Oh, it was lovely," she said quickly. "Very formal, very elegant. My parents, my father especially, had very specific ideas about how things should be. This feels more real." Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. There was wistfulness there, maybe even sadness, that seemed at odds with her description of a lovely childhood. "Do you see your parents often?" "Not as much as I probably should," she admitted. "We're different people. They love me, of course, but sometimes I feel like they love the idea of who they want me to be more than who I actually am." I understood that feeling, though I couldn't have explained why. There was something about Sarah that drew me in, made me want to protect her and nurture her and make sure she felt truly loved. Within a month of dating Matthew, she was calling me Mom, and it felt natural rather than forced. She started spending more and more time at my house, often arriving early for dinners with Matthew and staying to help with cooking or just to talk. She seemed starved for maternal attention in a way that broke my heart, and I found myself showering her with the affection I sensed she'd missed growing up. "Your mom is amazing," I overheard her tell Matthew one evening. "She makes me feel so accepted, like I don't have to be perfect to be loved." "She's pretty great," Matthew agreed. "I'm lucky she kept me." The phrase hit me oddly, but I dismissed it. Lots of parents joked about keeping their children, especially during the difficult teenage years. But as I got to know Sarah better, the sense of familiarity only grew stronger. She loved to cook, just like I did, and had an intuitive understanding of flavors and techniques that suggested real talent. She knew my grandmother's apple pie recipe after I taught it to her just once, and when she made it herself, it tasted exactly like my grandmother's had. "How did you know to add the nutmeg?" I asked, tasting her version. "I didn't mention that ingredient." She looked surprised. "I don't know. It just seemed like something was missing, and nutmeg felt right." When she laughed, really laughed, not the polite social laughter, but the deep, genuine sound of pure joy, something in my chest ached. It was familiar in a way that made no logical sense, like hearing an echo of something I'd lost long ago. I started paying attention to details I couldn't explain why I noticed. The way she sang along to songs on the radio, her voice hitting notes that sounded like lullabies I'd once known. The way she held her coffee cup, wrapping both hands around it like she was trying to warm herself from the inside out. The way she looked at Matthew, with a love so pure and complete, it reminded me of something I'd felt once before. "When's your birthday?" I asked her one evening while we were cooking dinner together. "June 15th, she said, and the spoon I was holding clattered to the floor. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. "Fine, just clumsy," I managed, but my hands were shaking as I picked up the spoon. June 15th, Sarah's birthday, but it was impossible. Sarah Castellano couldn't be my daughter. My daughter was living with a family named Castellano, but thousands of families had that name. It was just a coincidence. A cruel, impossible coincidence. Except the coincidences kept piling up. Sarah was 31 years old, exactly the age my daughter would be. She'd been adopted as an infant, something she mentioned casually during one of our cooking sessions. She had no clear memories of her earliest years, no baby pictures from before age 2, no stories about her infancy that her parents had shared with her. "My parents aren't big on nostalgia," she explained when I asked about baby pictures. "They're very focused on the present and future." She looked like me, not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but in small details that became more apparent the more time I spent with her. The shape of her hands, the way her eyebrows arched, the dimple in her left cheek that appeared when she really smiled. Most tellingly, she looked like Matthew. They had the same eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of gesturing when they got excited about something. I'd dismissed it as the kind of similarity that couples sometimes develop, but now I was seeing it differently. "Has anyone ever told you that you and Matthew could be siblings?" I asked one evening, trying to keep my voice casual. Sarah laughed. "All the time. We get that a lot. I guess we just have compatible genetics." "Compatible genetics?" If they were brother and sister, they would indeed have compatible genetics. But I couldn't voice my suspicions. They were too horrific to speak aloud, too impossible to believe. I was letting my own grief and guilt create connections that didn't exist, seeing my lost daughter in a woman who just happened to share some superficial similarities. Instead, I watched. I listened. I stored away every detail, every coincidence, every moment that felt like déjà vu. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was projecting my own losses onto Matthew's happiness. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I began to suspect the truth. When Matthew proposed and Sarah said yes, I was thrilled for their happiness and terrified by my growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The engagement party was at Sarah's parents' house, and I met Robert and Diane Castellano for the first time in 31 years. They were older, of course, but I recognized them immediately. Robert was still tall and distinguished, his hair now silver instead of brown, his face lined with age but still handsome. Diane was still petite and elegant, though her blonde hair was clearly maintained now rather than natural. They didn't recognize me. Why would they? I'd been a scared 23-year-old girl when they'd last seen me, thin and worn down by poverty and difficult choices. Now I was a successful 54-year-old woman, confident and established, completely different from the person I'd been, but I knew them. I knew the way Robert's jaw tightened when he was displeased, the way Diane's smile never quite reached her eyes when she was uncomfortable. I knew them, and I knew that Sarah was my daughter, and I knew that she was about to marry her brother, and I had no idea what to do about it. I couldn't tell Matthew without proof, couldn't destroy his happiness based on suspicions and coincidences. I couldn't tell Sarah without risking her relationship with the only parents she'd ever known. I couldn't tell the Castellanos without admitting that I'd figured out their secret, assuming they even knew who I was. So I said nothing, and watched, and hoped desperately that I was wrong. The wedding planning began, and immediately, I felt the exclusion. It started small, suggestions that were politely declined, offers of help that were redirected, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I told myself it was normal mother-in-law territory, the natural friction between a bride's family and the groom's family, but it escalated quickly into something that felt personal and deliberate. "We've decided to go with a smaller ceremony," Sarah told me one afternoon while we were looking at venue options. "Just immediate family." "Of course," I said. "That makes sense. And we're thinking of doing the reception at the Riverside Manor. It's beautiful, but the space is limited, so we'll have to be selective about the guest list." "I understand. Just let me know what you need from me." But as the weeks passed, it became clear that what they needed from me was to stay out of the way. Every suggestion I made was politely declined. Every offer to help was redirected to someone else. When I asked about my role in the ceremony, I was told that they were keeping things simple. The final blow came during a planning meeting at the Castellanos' house. Sarah, Diane, the wedding coordinator, and I were discussing seating arrangements when Diane pulled out a detailed chart. "Now, for the head table," she said. "We'll have the bride and groom in the center, then Robert and myself, Sarah's grandparents from Italy." I waited for my name to be mentioned. It wasn't. "Where will I be sitting?" I asked when the discussion moved on to other tables. The room went quiet. Diane looked at Sarah, who looked at the wedding coordinator, who suddenly became very interested in her notes. "Well," Diane said finally, "space is quite limited at the head table, and with Sarah's grandparents flying in from Italy, plus Robert's business partner who's officiating—" "Of course," I said quickly. "I understand. Just let me know which table you'd like me at." Another exchange of glances. The wedding coordinator consulted her chart. "There's a lovely table near the kitchen," she said with forced brightness. "You'll have a wonderful view of the ceremony and reception. Near the kitchen, at my own son's wedding." I looked at Matthew, waiting for him to object, to insist that his mother sit with the family. He was studying his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment but his mouth firmly closed. "That sounds fine," I managed to say. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. I was being deliberately excluded from my son's wedding, relegated to the servants' area like an unwanted guest. And Matthew, my Matthew, who I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, was letting it happen. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the venue early, dressed in my navy blue mother-of-the-groom dress and the pearls that had been my grandmother's. I'd spent weeks choosing that outfit. wanting to look appropriate and elegant without upstaging anyone. Now it felt like a costume, formal wear for a performance I didn't understand. The Riverside Manor was even more beautiful than I'd expected. The gardens were in full bloom, roses and peonies creating a romantic backdrop for the ceremony. The ballroom was decorated in ivory and gold, with crystal chandeliers and silk draping that transformed the space into something magical. It was exactly the kind of wedding I'd dreamed of for Matthew, elegant and sophisticated and perfect in every detail. Except I wasn't part of it. When I tried to enter through the main entrance, security stopped me. "Ma'am, family members are being directed to the east entrance today. I'm the groom's mother," I said, confused. He checked his list, running his finger down the page until he found my name. "Mrs. Thompson, you're being directed to the service entrance, please." The service entrance. Not even the east entrance with the rest of the family. The service entrance, used by caterers and vendors and hired help. I followed his directions in a daze, walking around the building to a plain door marked "Staff Only." Inside was a world of organized chaos. Caterers prepping final touches, servers polishing glasses, florists making last-minute adjustments to centerpieces. The air was thick with the smells of garlic and herbs, champagne and flowers, the sounds of preparation and anticipation. A young woman in a black uniform approached me immediately. "You must be Matthew's mother. I'm Jenny, the catering manager. We've been expecting you." She led me through the bustling kitchen to a corner near the prep station, where someone had set up a small area with a folding chair and a mirror propped against boxes of champagne. "This is where you can get ready," Jenny said cheerfully. "We'll make sure you have everything you need." I stared at the makeshift dressing area, the single folding chair that looked like it belonged in a church basement, the mirror that reflected my image back in fragments. "This must be a mistake," I said slowly. "I'm the mother of the groom." Jenny's face flushed red. "I'm so sorry, but this is what we were instructed to prepare." Apparently there were some complications with the bridal suite space allocation. Complications. As if my presence at my own son's wedding was a logistical problem to be managed rather than a celebration to be shared. But I stayed, because this was Matthew's day and I would not miss it, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how humiliated I felt. I would not give them the satisfaction of driving me away. I sat in that folding chair and listened to the ceremony through the kitchen doors. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon, and I pressed my ear to the crack to hear the officiant speak, to catch glimpses of my son standing at the altar in his grandfather's tuxedo. Matthew looked so handsome, so confident, so happy. For a moment, watching him smile as Sarah approached down the aisle, all my hurt and confusion melted away. This was my baby, the little boy I'd raised and loved and protected, becoming a man and starting his own family. Whatever else was happening, whatever cruel games were being played by people who should know better, this moment was beautiful. Sarah was radiant in her wedding dress, a confection of silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's cars. She moved down the aisle like she was floating, her face glowing with happiness and love. When she reached Matthew and took his hand, the look that passed between them was so intimate, so full of joy and promise, that I found myself crying despite everything. The ceremony was beautiful. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, full of promises about growing old together and supporting each other's dreams. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was thunderous, and I clapped along from my hiding spot behind the kitchen door. But even in that moment of joy, I felt the wrongness of it. Something about the scene felt fundamentally broken, like watching a beautiful painting that was hanging upside down. The reception began, and I watched through the service window as guests found their seats. The head table was magnificent. White linens, crystal glasses, centerpieces that cascaded with white roses and baby's breath. Matthew and Sarah sat in the center, flanked by both sets of parents, looking like the perfect picture of familial harmony. Except one parent was missing. My table near the kitchen turned out to be literally in the kitchen, a folding table set up between the coffee station and the dish return. A server brought me my plate with an expression of embarrassment and confusion. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry about this setup. Are you sure you're not supposed to be out there with the other families?" "Apparently not," I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. I ate my chicken cordon bleu, surrounded by the sounds of clattering dishes and muffled conversation from the real party happening beyond the doors. Servers rushed past me carrying trays of food and dirty plates, occasionally offering apologetic smiles for the chaos around me. Through it all, I kept thinking about Sarah, about the coincidences that were piling up into an impossible truth, about the way Robert and Diane had orchestrated my exclusion from the beginning, about the terrible possibility that I was watching my daughter marry my son. And then came the toasts. I could hear them through the doors. Matthew's college friends sharing embarrassing stories, Sarah's maid of honor talking about their friendship, various relatives offering wishes for happiness and prosperity. The laughter and applause felt like it was coming from another world, one where I didn't exist. Finally, Robert Castellano stood to give the father of the bride's toast. I moved closer to my crack in the door, watching as he stood at the head table with a champagne flute in his hand and a microphone clipped to his lapel. Sarah was beaming up at him, her hand clasped in Matthew's, both of them glowing with happiness and champagne. "My beautiful daughter," Robert began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom. "Today you've made me the proudest father in the world. You've chosen a wonderful young man to share your life with, and I couldn't be happier for you both." Standard father of the bride material. I half tuned out, watching Matthew's face instead, how happy he looked, how completely unaware he was of the storm that was about to break over all of us. "Sarah, you've brought such joy to our lives from the moment you came to us," Robert continued, and something in his tone made me focus more intently. "And I want everyone here to know what an incredible woman she's become, despite—" He paused, and in that pause, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the circumstances that brought her into our lives. I watched Sarah's face change, the smile faltering as confusion crept in. She looked around the table, seeking reassurance that never came. "You see," Robert said, his voice now carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "Sarah isn't our biological daughter." The room went completely silent. I could see guests looking at each other across their tables, confusion rippling through the crowd like a wave, but I was focused on Sarah, watching the color drain from her face as her father spoke words that would change everything. 31 years ago, a young woman came to our restaurant, desperate and alone. My legs nearly gave out. He was talking about me, about that night when I was 8 months pregnant, broke and terrified, when I'd gone to Castellanos hoping for a job and instead found the couple who would adopt my daughter. She was pregnant and had nowhere to go. She'd been abandoned by the father of her child, left to figure out everything on her own. Sarah's face was white now, her grip on Matthew's hand so tight her knuckles were showing, but she wasn't looking at Robert anymore. She was looking at me through the crack in the door, our eyes meeting across the chaos of revelation and recognition. Diane and I had been trying to have children for years with no success. When this brave young woman asked if we knew anyone who might want to adopt her baby, we saw it as a gift from God. "Dad," Sarah whispered, and the microphone picked up her voice, broadcasting her shock to the entire room. "We promised her we'd give her daughter the best life possible, and we did. Sarah has had every advantage, every opportunity. She's become the remarkable woman you see today." "Stop," Sarah said louder, trying to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. "But I think it's time for the truth," Robert continued, his voice rising above the murmurs of confusion from the guests. "Sarah, sweetheart, your birth mother is someone who knows you, someone who has watched you grow into the woman you are today. I wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but watching this moment unfold, but I was frozen, trapped by the horrible inevitability of what was coming next." "Your birth mother," Robert said, looking directly at the crack in the door where I was hiding, "is Matthew's mother. Sarah, honey, you're marrying your brother." The sound that came from Sarah was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started as a gasp, became a wail, ended as something raw and broken that seemed to tear its way out of her chest. She tried to stand again, swayed, and then collapsed, her beautiful wedding dress spreading around her like spilled milk as she hit the marble floor. The room erupted. Guests gasped and screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as people jumped up. Someone was shouting for a doctor. But all I could focus on was Sarah on the floor and Matthew kneeling beside her, both of them looking like their world had just ended, because it had. Before I tell you what happened next, And trust me, you need to hear how this impossible situation gets even more complicated. Please take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. The next part of this story will show you just how deep this betrayal really goes, and why sometimes the people who claim to protect us are the ones who hurt us most. Hit that subscribe button because you won't believe what I discovered about Robert's true motives. I burst through the kitchen doors without thinking, my own legs barely supporting me as I pushed through the crowd toward my children. My children, both of them, the son I'd raised and the daughter I'd given away, brought together by love and torn apart by the truth. "Stop!" I screamed, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to stop. The words were already out, the damage already done, the secret that I'd carried for 31 years now public knowledge. Robert saw me coming and stepped back from the microphone, but his expression wasn't one of remorse or shock. It was satisfaction, like a man who'd finally completed a long-planned project. "There she is," he said into the microphone, and his words carried across the silent ballroom, "the woman who gave her daughter away and then tried to steal her back." "That's not true," I cried, dropping to my knees beside Sarah and Matthew. I didn't know." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in their eyes. How could I not have known? How could I have watched them fall in love, get engaged, plan a wedding, and not realize that Sarah was my daughter? Sarah was conscious but barely coherent, staring up at me with eyes full of betrayal and horror. "You knew," she whispered. "You had to know." "I swear to you, I had no idea," I said, reaching for her, but she flinched away from my touch. "Sarah, baby, I would never have let this happen if I'd known." "Don't call me that," she said, her voice broken. "Don't you dare call me that." Matthew was silent, staring between Sarah and me like he couldn't process what he was hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow and distant. "You gave her away." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, and it hit me like a physical blow. "Matthew, please let me explain. You gave my wife away and then you watched us fall in love and said nothing." "I didn't know," I screamed, and the rawness in my voice seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. "Do you think I would have stood by and watched this happen if I'd known? Do you think I'm that cruel?" But I could see in their faces that they weren't sure, that the woman they'd thought they knew, the devoted mother, the loving mother-in-law, had been revealed as someone capable of secrets they couldn't comprehend. Sarah struggled to her feet, Matthew helping her despite his own shock. Together, they looked at me with expressions that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We're leaving," Sarah said quietly. "Sarah, please, don't follow us. Don't call us. Don't contact us at all." They walked out together, Sarah's wedding dress trailing behind her like the remnants of a dream, leaving me kneeling on the marble floor in front of 200 wedding guests who were staring at me like I was a monster. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, people began to leave. Some offered awkward condolences, others just stared, but most simply gathered their belongings and departed as quickly as possible. Within an hour, the beautiful reception hall was empty, except for staff cleaning up the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. I sat alone at my folding table in the kitchen, still in my navy blue dress, watching caterers pack away the untouched wedding cake and stack chairs for storage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd started the day as an unwanted guest, and I was ending it as exactly that. But now, I knew why. Robert found me there an hour later, after the last guest had gone and the staff had finished their cleanup. He looked tired but not regretful, like a man who'd accomplished something difficult but necessary. "You know," he said, pulling up a chair across from me, "I've been waiting 31 years for this moment. You knew who I was. From the day Matthew brought Sarah home for the first time, I recognized you immediately. The casual cruelty of his admission took my breath away. You let them fall in love knowing who they were to each other. I let them fall in love knowing exactly what would happen when the truth came out. Why?" Robert's expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw the real man behind the polished facade. "Because you gave up the right to be her mother 31 years ago. You signed papers, you walked away, you let us raise her and love her and give her everything you couldn't. And then she meets your son, and suddenly you're back in her life, playing the role you abandoned. I never tried to replace you, didn't you? Sarah calls you mom. She spends more time at your house than ours. She talks about you constantly, about how warm and accepting you are, how you make her feel loved without conditions. She was pulling away from us, Catherine. She was choosing you." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "So you decided to destroy us all. I decided to protect my family by revealing the truth in the cruelest possible way in front of 200 people on their wedding day, by making sure Sarah understood the kind of woman her birth mother really is, someone who gives away children when they become inconvenient, someone who watches her own son fall in love with his sister and says nothing. I didn't know, but you suspected, didn't you? Robert leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Tell me you never wondered. Tell me you never noticed the resemblance, the coincidences, the way she seemed so familiar. I couldn't tell him that, because it would have been a lie. I had wondered, had noticed, had felt the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. But I'd ignored my instincts, told myself I was imagining things, chosen to protect my own happiness over the truth. I should have realized sooner, I admitted. I should have done something. Yes, you should have, but you didn't, because like always, you chose the easy path, just like you did 31 years ago when you decided it was easier to give Sarah away than to fight for her. His words were designed to wound, and they hit their mark. Every fear I'd ever had about my choice to place Sarah for adoption, every moment of doubt and regret and self-recrimination came flooding back with double force. I was 23 years old and alone. You were selfish. You chose your own comfort over your child's welfare, just like you chose your own happiness over her welfare today. That's not fair, isn't it? Robert stood up, straightening his tie like he was heading to a business meeting instead of walking away from the destruction of 3 lives. You've lost her twice now, Catherine. The first time was your choice. This time, it's hers. He walked away, leaving me alone in the empty kitchen with the remnants of my son's wedding and the ruins of everything I thought I knew about my life. The days that followed were the darkest I'd ever experienced. Matthew wouldn't return my calls, wouldn't answer his door when I went to his apartment, wouldn't respond to the letters I left with his doorman. Sarah had blocked my number completely, and when I tried to reach out through social media, I found that she'd deleted all photos of me, removed me from her contacts, erased me from her digital life as completely as if I'd never existed. The wedding was annulled within a week. I learned about it through a mutual acquaintance, not from Matthew or Sarah directly. They were handling it quietly, trying to minimize the scandal and gossip that was already spreading through their social circles. I threw myself into work, staying at the restaurant until midnight, coming in at dawn, anything to avoid the empty silence of my house. My staff was worried. They'd never seen me so distracted, so distant, so unlike the warm, engaging woman they knew me to be. Chef, my sous chef Tony finally said after I'd burned my 3rd sauce in 2 days, maybe you should take some time off. Get some rest. I'm fine, I said automatically, though we both knew it was a lie. You're not fine. None of us have seen you smile since the wedding. What happened? But how could I explain? How could I tell him that I'd discovered my daughter was marrying my son, that I'd been excluded from the ceremony like an unwanted stranger, that the family I thought I'd built had crumbled in the space of a single toast? Instead, I worked. I cooked until my hands were raw, cleaned until the restaurant sparkled, planned menus and managed inventory, and lost myself in the familiar rhythms of professional cooking. But nothing could fill the void that had opened in my chest, the hollow space where my children's love used to live. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was closing up the restaurant alone when I heard a knock on the front door. Through the glass, I could see a small, elderly woman with silver hair, wearing a black coat despite the warm evening. I almost didn't answer. We were closed, and I wasn't in the mood for customers who couldn't read signs, but something about the woman's posture, the way she stood with quiet dignity, hands folded in front of her, made me reconsider. When I opened the door, she smiled gently. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Elena Castellano, Sarah's nonna. My heart stopped. Sarah's grandmother, the one who'd flown in from Italy for the wedding, was standing outside my restaurant at 9 o'clock at night. Mrs. Castellano, I don't know what to say. May I come in? I have things to tell you that cannot be said on the street. I led her to a table in the back corner of the dining room, away from the windows where anyone could see us. Elena moved carefully but with purpose, settling into her chair with the grace of someone who'd lived through difficult times and survived them. First, she said, I want you to know that what my son did was unforgivable. The way he revealed the truth, the timing, the cruelty of it all. It goes against everything I taught him about family and honor. I was surprised by her directness, by the way she immediately acknowledged the wrong that had been done. He was protecting his daughter. He was protecting his ego. Elena's voice was firm, brooking no argument. And in doing so, he destroyed 3 innocent people. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it on the table between us. There are things you need to know about Robert, about the way he's manipulated this situation from the beginning, things that Sarah doesn't know, that will help you understand why this happened. What kind of things? Elena opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. My hands shook as I looked through them. Pictures of me at work, walking to my car, at Matthew's high school graduation, recent pictures that had obviously been taken without my knowledge. Robert hired a private investigator to find you when Sarah was 16. He's been watching you for 15 years. The world tilted. Watching me? He knew you worked at Grace's kitchen. He knew about Matthew, about your marriage to James, about James's death. He's been monitoring your life. Waiting for what? For exactly what happened. When Sarah started dating Matthew, Robert realized immediately who he was. He could have told them both privately, could have handled it with discretion and kindness. Instead, he chose to let it play out. The cruelest realization was dawning. He wanted them to fall in love. He wanted to hurt you. You see, Robert has always been obsessed with control, with being the center of Sarah's universe. When she was growing up, he would tell her stories about her birth mother, how young and irresponsible you were, how you abandoned her because you didn't want the responsibility of a child. My chest tightened with pain. He told Sarah I didn't want her? Worse, he painted a picture of you as selfish and weak, someone who chose her own comfort over her child's welfare. He wanted to make sure that if Sarah ever found you, she would already see you as a villain. Elena pulled out more papers, copies of correspondence, financial records, documentation that painted a picture of systematic manipulation and control. When Sarah started pulling away from Robert and Diane as she got older, when she started making her own choices and questioning their authority, Robert saw it as a betrayal. The idea that she might want a relationship with her birth mother was his worst nightmare, so he made sure it would be impossible. He engineered a situation where you would be revealed as someone who watched her own son fall in love with his sister and said nothing. In his mind, this would turn Sarah against you forever and prove that he was right about your character all along. I stared at the photographs, seeing my life through the lens of someone else's surveillance. Every moment of happiness I'd found in the past 15 years had been watched, cataloged, analyzed by someone who was planning to use it against me. Does Sarah know about any of this? Not yet, but she needs to know, and it needs to come from you. She won't see me. She's blocked my number, won't answer my letters. She's hurt and confused and angry, but she's also intelligent, and eventually she'll start asking the right questions. When she does, she'll need these answers. Elena pushed the envelope toward me. The question is, what are you going to do with the truth? I carried that envelope home like it contained explosives. In many ways it did. Information that could blow apart what remained of Sarah's relationship with her adoptive parents. Proof of manipulation and deception that went back decades. But it was also vindication. Evidence that I wasn't the monster Robert had painted me to be, that the situation hadn't unfolded naturally, but had been orchestrated by someone who saw me as a threat to his control over Sarah. The question Elena had posed haunted me. What was I going to do with the truth? I could expose Robert's manipulation, show Sarah the photographs and documents that proved he'd been planning this destruction for years. But that would mean destroying her relationship with the only father she'd ever known, forcing her to confront the fact that her entire childhood had been built on lies and control. I could stay silent, let Robert's version of events stand, accept that I would be seen as the villain who had given away her child, and then watched her fall in love with her brother. It would mean sacrificing any chance of a relationship with Sarah, but it would preserve her relationship with her adoptive family. Or I could try to find a middle path, a way to share the truth without destroying everyone in the process. I was still wrestling with these choices when Sarah appeared at my door a week later. She looked terrible, thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless emotional turmoil. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, looking more like a lost college student than the polished woman I'd known. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. I led her to my kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd cooked together so many times, where I'd taught her my grandmother's recipes without knowing I was passing down family traditions to my own daughter. Now it felt like a museum of lost possibilities, every corner filled with memories of what we'd been before the truth destroyed it all. "I don't know what to call you," she said, sitting at my small table where we'd shared so many conversations. "You can call me whatever feels right. Nothing feels right." Her voice was small, broken. "Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie." "Not everything, Sarah. Your feelings were real. The love you have for Matthew, the friendships you've built, The woman you've become? None of that was a lie. I fell in love with my brother. The words came out flat, matter of fact, like she was stating the weather. You fell in love with a good man who happened to be related to you. You had no way of knowing. How could I not know? She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and confusion. How could I not feel some kind of recognition, some instinct that told me something was wrong? Because you were raised by loving parents who never gave you reason to question your place in their family. Because blood doesn't always call to blood the way people think it does. Because sometimes love is stronger than biology. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Tell me about when I was born. The request hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought about that day every year on her birthday, replayed every moment, every sensation, every emotion, but I'd never spoken about it aloud. You were born at 6:47 p.m. on June 15th, I began slowly. It was a Wednesday, and it had been raining all day. You weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces, and you had the most amazing shock of dark hair. I told her everything, about the labor, about holding her for those precious hours, about the lullaby I'd sung while memorizing every detail of her face. I told her about the letters I'd written but never sent, about the birthday wishes I'd made alone every year, about the part of my heart that had always belonged to the daughter I'd given away. Did you want to keep me? The question was whispered, like she was afraid of the answer. More than anything in the world, I said honestly. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hold on, to find a way to make it work, to refuse to let you go. Then why didn't you? Because I was 23 and scared and alone. Because I thought love meant giving you the best possible life, even if it meant breaking my own heart. Because I thought you deserved better than what I could provide. What if you'd kept me? What if we'd found a way to make it work? I thought about that alternate timeline, the one where I'd been brave enough or foolish enough to believe that love really could conquer all. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe we would have struggled financially but been happy. Maybe I would have found a way to build a good life for both of us. Maybe you would have grown up knowing you were loved and wanted from day one. Or maybe I would have grown up poor and resentful, watching other kids have things I couldn't have. Maybe. There's no way to know for sure. Sarah was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. I've missed 31 years of knowing my real mother. You had a real mother. Diane loved you, raised you, was there for every milestone and achievement. She's your mother too, but not my first mother. Not the woman who carried me and gave birth to me and held me when I was brand new. No, I said softly, not your first mother. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in thoughts of what might have been, what could never be recovered, what we might still be able to build from the wreckage. Finally, Sarah spoke again. There's something I need to tell you, something I've figured out. I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything again. My father, Robert, he knew who you were from the beginning, didn't he? The moment of truth had arrived. I could lie, protect her from the worst of Robert's manipulation, let her hold on to some illusions about her adoptive family, or I could trust her with the complete truth and let her decide what to do with it. I chose truth. Yes, I said simply. How long? I pulled out Elena's envelope, spreading the photographs and documents across my kitchen table like evidence in a trial. 15 years. Since you were 16. Sarah's face went through a series of emotions as she looked through the evidence of her father's surveillance and manipulation. Shock, betrayal, anger, and finally a kind of cold understanding. He planned this, she said quietly. He let me fall in love with Matthew knowing exactly what would happen. Yes. He wanted to hurt you, to prove that you were the kind of person he'd always told me you were. Yes. And he was willing to destroy me and Matthew to do it. Yes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the full scope of what had been done to all of us. When she finally looked at me again, there was something different in her eyes. Not the warmth I remembered, but not the hatred either. Something harder, more determined. I want to know you, she said finally. Not as Matthew's mother-in-law, not as some stranger who happens to share my DNA. I want to know you as my mother, Sarah. I know it's complicated. I know I have parents who raised me and loved me, however flawed their methods were. But you're my mother too, and I've missed 31 years of knowing you. I don't want to miss any more. The words were everything I'd dreamed of hearing for 3 decades, but they came wrapped in such pain and complication that I almost couldn't bear them. What about Matthew? Sarah's face crumpled slightly. I don't know. He's so angry, so hurt. He feels betrayed by everyone. You, me, his whole understanding of his life. He has every right to be angry. But he's my brother. And despite everything that's happened, despite the horrible mess we're in, I love him. Not the way I thought I did, but he's my family, my actual biological family, and I can't just lose him. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, but I know I want you in my life. I know I want to understand where I came from, who you are, what pieces of myself I inherited from you. She paused, looking around my kitchen with new eyes. Is this where you taught me to cook? When I was dating Matthew? Yes. I felt so at home here, like I belonged in a way I'd never felt anywhere else. Maybe that's why, I said softly. Maybe some part of you recognized home. We spent the next several hours talking, filling in pieces of the puzzle that was our relationship. I told her about my childhood, about her birth father David, about the choices that had led me to place her for adoption. She told me about growing up with Robert and Diane, about always feeling like something was missing, about the dreams she'd had of a woman who sang lullabies in a voice she almost recognized. I used to dream about you, she said as the evening grew late. About a woman who smelled like vanilla and sang "You Are My Sunshine." Diane thought I was making it up, but I always wore vanilla perfume, I whispered, and that was the song I sang to you every night before the adoption. I remember, she said, and the recognition in her voice was like a miracle. Somewhere deep down, I remember. When she finally left that night, we'd established something tentative but real. Not the mother-daughter relationship we'd lost, but the possibility of building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But Matthew was still another matter entirely. I didn't see him for 2 more weeks, not until he showed up at my restaurant on a Tuesday night, long after we'd closed. He looked as bad as Sarah had, thin, exhausted, like someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. We need to talk, he said when I let him in through the back door. We sat in my empty restaurant, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds of the kitchen where I'd built my career, and I waited for my son to decide whether he could forgive me. Sarah told me about the photographs, he said finally, about Robert knowing who you were all along. I'm sorry, Matthew. I'm sorry for all of it. Are you sorry for giving her away in the first place? The question was direct, uncompromising, and deserved an honest answer. I'm sorry for the pain it caused all of us. I'm sorry for the secrets and lies that grew up around it. I'm sorry that you and Sarah were hurt by choices I made before either of you were born. But are you sorry for making the choice itself? I thought about that scared 23-year-old girl, alone and pregnant and facing an impossible decision. I thought about the 31 years of wondering and regretting and hoping. I thought about Sarah, raised with love and opportunities and advantages I could never have provided. No, I said finally. I'm not sorry for making the choice I thought was best for her at the time. Matthew was quiet for a long time, processing my answer. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. I need you to understand something. When I found out Sarah was my sister, it felt like my entire life had been a lie. Everything I thought I knew about family, about love, about you, all of it felt false. Matthew, let me finish. He held up a hand, his eyes serious. But after talking to Sarah, after learning about what Robert did, I'm starting to understand that the lies weren't yours. You didn't know who she was any more than we did. I should have figured it out sooner. There were signs. Were there? Really? Or are you just torturing yourself with hindsight? I thought about the coincidences that had seemed so obvious in retrospect. The birthday, the age, the resemblances I'd dismissed as imagination. I don't know, I admitted. I honestly don't know if I could have figured it out without more information. Sarah thinks Robert deliberately kept information from her that might have helped you connect the dots. Details about her birth, her early medical records, even basic facts about the adoption process. That made sense. Robert had controlled the narrative from the beginning, sharing only what supported his version of events while hiding anything that might have led to recognition. So where does that leave us? I asked. I don't know, Matthew said honestly. I'm angry and hurt and confused about everything. But I also know that you're my mother, and you raised me with love and honesty and everything you could give me. That doesn't change because of what happened. What about Sarah? Matthew's expression was complicated. Grief and love and loss all mixed together. Sarah is my sister. I'm never going to stop loving her, but it's a different kind of love now. We're family, but we can't be what we were. How is she doing? She's struggling. She's angry at Robert for manipulating all of us, angry at the situation, angry at the unfairness of it all, but she's also trying to figure out who she is now, who she wants to be. Is she okay living with Robert and Diane? After everything that's come out? Matthew shook his head. She moved out. She's staying with friends right now, trying to figure out her next steps. Her relationship with Robert is Complicated. She's not ready to cut him out completely, but she can't forgive what he did either. We talked until nearly midnight, working through anger and hurt and confusion, trying to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty, rather than the secrets that had nearly destroyed us all. I want you to know, Matthew said as he was leaving, that I understand why you made the choice you did. I don't like it, and part of me will probably always wish you'd found a way to keep her, but I understand it. Thank you, I said, and I meant it more than he could know. But Mom, he paused at the door. No more secrets. Whatever happens from here on out, we tell each other the truth. No more secrets, I agreed. Over the next several months, we slowly began to rebuild our family. Not the family we'd been before, but something new and different and honest. Sarah started coming to Sunday dinners again, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as we learned how to be mother and daughter, rather than mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Matthew joined us after a few weeks, and gradually, we figured out how to be siblings instead of husband and wife. It was strange and sometimes painful, watching them navigate a relationship that had fundamentally changed, but still contained deep love and affection. It's weird, Sarah admitted one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. I know all his habits, all his quirks, all the things that used to annoy me about him, but now they're just brotherly quirks instead of husband quirks. Do you miss what you had before? She considered the question carefully. I miss the simplicity of it. I miss not having to think about the complexity of our relationship, but I don't miss him romantically, if that's what you're asking. Once I understood that he was my brother, those feelings just shifted, like my brain rewired itself to see him differently. What about the future? Marriage? Children? All of that? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Right now, I'm focused on figuring out who I am and what kind of relationships I want to have. With you, with Matthew, even with Robert and Diane. The situation with her adoptive parents remained complicated. Sarah was speaking to them, but the relationship was strained by Robert's manipulation and Diane's complicity in keeping secrets. They were in family therapy, trying to work through decades of control and deception, but progress was slow. Diane keeps apologizing, Sarah told me one day. She says she didn't know about the photographs, about Robert hiring the investigator. She thought his opposition to our relationship was just normal parental protectiveness. Do you believe her? I want to, but I'm not sure it matters. Whether she knew the specifics or not, she participated in excluding you, in making sure you felt unwelcome at your own son's wedding. She was protecting what she saw as her family, and in doing so, she helped destroy what could have been a bigger, more complicated, but ultimately more honest family. Sarah was seeing a therapist individually as well, working through the identity issues that came with discovering her entire origin story was different from what she'd believed. Some days were harder than others, but gradually, she seemed to be finding peace with the complexity of having multiple families, multiple mothers, multiple versions of herself. I used to think identity was something you were born with, she told me during one of our cooking sessions. Something fixed and unchangeable. But I'm learning that identity is something you choose, something you build piece by piece with love and truth and forgiveness. What have you chosen? I've chosen to be Sarah Castellano, raised with love by parents who wanted me desperately, even if their methods were sometimes flawed. I've chosen to be Sarah Thompson, born to a mother who loved me enough to give me away and fought to find me again when the truth came out. I've chosen to be Matthew's sister, and that relationship is more precious to me than the marriage we almost had, because it's built on honesty instead of deception. 6 months after the wedding that destroyed everything, we had a different kind of celebration. Not a wedding, but a family reunion of sorts. Sarah, Matthew, Elena, who had become our unlikely ally and source of wisdom, and myself. We gathered in my kitchen on Sarah's birthday, the first one I'd been able to celebrate with her since the day she was born. I made my grandmother's apple pie, the recipe I'd taught Sarah years earlier when I didn't know she was mine to teach. We lit 32 candles, one to grow on, as my grandmother used to say, and for the first time in 3 decades, I got to sing happy birthday to my daughter. I want to tell you something, Sarah said as we sat around the table eating pie and talking about everything and nothing. I've been writing about all of this, about the wedding, about finding out the truth, about learning to build a family from broken pieces. She pulled out a notebook, thick with pages covered in her careful handwriting. I want to publish it, not for fame or money, but because I think there are other families out there dealing with secrets and lies and impossible choices. I want them to know that love can survive anything, even the truth. What kind of book? I asked. a memoir, about adoption and identity and family and forgiveness, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose, about learning that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you can also lead to the best thing. Matthew leaned over to read a page, then looked up with tears in his eyes. "This is beautiful, Sarah. You should definitely publish it." "I want both of you to help me write it," she said. "I want it to be our story, not just mine. All the perspectives, all the pain and healing and growth." "Are you sure?" I asked. "It means exposing everything, the manipulation, the secrets, the hurt we've all caused each other. I'm sure. I think truth is the only way forward, even when it's ugly and complicated." We spent the next year working on Sarah's book, meeting every week to share memories, perspectives, and hard-won wisdom. It was sometimes painful, reliving the worst moments of our relationship, but it was also healing. We learned things about each other that we'd never known, understood motivations that had previously seemed inexplicable, forgave hurts that had seemed unforgivable. The book was published 2 years later, and it found its audience: other adoptees searching for identity, other families dealing with devastating secrets, other people learning that love is both more fragile and more resilient than we ever imagined. But for me, the real victory wasn't publication or recognition. It was smaller than that and infinitely more precious. It was Sarah calling me Mom for the first time on Mother's Day, 3 years after the wedding that brought us together and tore us apart. It was Matthew walking me down the aisle when I married Frank, a kind widower who loved our complicated family without question or judgment. It was the phone call from Sarah telling me she was engaged to a wonderful man named David, the irony of the name wasn't lost on any of us, and asking if I would help plan the wedding. It was the moment, 4 years after the disaster at Riverside Manor, when Sarah asked me to stand beside her at her real wedding, not as the mother of the groom, but as the mother of the bride. It was learning that sometimes the people who try to destroy your family end up showing you who your real family is. Robert never apologized for his manipulation, never acknowledged the pain he'd caused all of us. His relationship with Sarah remained strained, though they maintained contact for the sake of family peace. Diane worked harder to rebuild trust, and eventually, she and Sarah found a new equilibrium based on honesty about the past and respect for Sarah's autonomy. But the real family we built was different from anything any of us had expected. It was messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but it was also honest and resilient and built on choice rather than obligation. Today, as I write this final chapter of our story, my kitchen is full of voices and laughter. Sarah is teaching her husband how to make my grandmother's pie crust, using the same techniques I taught her years ago when I didn't know I was passing down family traditions to my own daughter. Matthew is arguing with his fiancée about wedding flowers, and Frank is reading the newspaper while offering commentary that makes everyone laugh. It's chaos and noise and beautiful imperfection. It's a family that was blown apart by secrets and rebuilt through truth. It's proof that love doesn't conquer all, but it conquers enough. The woman who gave her daughter away learned how to get her back, not through legal battles or emotional manipulation, but through patience and honesty, and the willingness to let love be complicated. The son who felt betrayed learned how to trust again, not blindly, but with the wisdom that comes from surviving deception and choosing connection anyway. The daughter who lost herself learned how to be found, not by returning to who she'd been before, but by building something entirely new from the pieces of her fractured identity. And the family that was destroyed by lies learned how to build something stronger from the wreckage, a family based on choice and truth, and the radical belief that love is worth fighting for, even when the fight is against your own assumptions about what love should look like. We learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it destroys everything you thought you wanted. We learned that family is something you create, not something you're born into, though biology can be a beautiful foundation if you let it. We learned that forgiveness is a daily choice, not a one-time decision, and that healing happens slowly, in moments of unexpected grace and ordinary kindness. Most importantly, we learned that love survives, not unchanged, not uncomplicated, not unscathed, but it survives and grows and becomes something deeper and more honest than what came before. The kitchen where I sit now, writing these final words, is full of the sounds of family, conversation and laughter, the clink of dishes being washed, the rustle of newspapers and recipe cards. Sarah is planning her second wedding, and this time, I'll be in the front row where I belong. Matthew is building a life with a woman who understands our complexity and loves us anyway. Frank is teaching Sarah's husband how to fix the leaky faucet that's been driving me crazy for months. It's not the family any of us planned. It's better because it's real and honest and built on the understanding that love is both more fragile and more powerful than we ever imagined. It's a family that survived the worst kind of betrayal and chose to rebuild rather than retreat. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family secrets or the power of forgiveness, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this remind us that healing is possible, that families can be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most broken situations can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? It's a family that learned the hardest truth of all, that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. And in my kitchen, surrounded by the voices of people who chose to love each other despite everything that tried to tear us apart, that feels like the most beautiful victory of all. The end.